Stuff I Like. That was it? I don't know. That was from Joseph Carpenter. It's nice little music, but so Monday, is Veterans Day, and Sunday is the 11th, is 11/11/11. It's the 11. It is the 11th month, the 11th day of the 11th month. This is the day on which World War One ended, and it ended. What was it? It was the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day. That's what it was, when the treaty went into effect and the fighting stopped. And World War One is something that, especially in this country where only came in at the last moment and saved the day, as we tended to do with Europe in the 20th century. But it's something that people in America especially do not understand, that it affects us to this day. To this day, at the turn of the century, England especially, Europe also, were at the height of civilization. They had taken civilization to a place it had never been before. They were standing at the pinnacle of human endeavor. They really were. And a mere 14 years later, they had essentially wiped out their entire civilization for no reason. I mean, it wiped out a generation of men. Russia became the Soviet Union during World War One. The Austro-Hungarian Empire came to an end. The Ottoman Empire was essentially brought to the end. It set the stage for the rise of Adolf Hitler, and it really was the end of the great civilization of Europe, which had lasted since the Renaissance at least, and had brought mankind, as I say, to a new level. And no one to this day, no one can tell you why this war began. Obviously, it began with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. But why? Why from that, this incredible domino collapse of nations, so that so much was destroyed, so much good was wiped off the face of the earth? In some way, you might think, it might have been German expansionism. The left has seized the narrative. The left seized the narrative afterwards, as they are very good at doing after a war, and sold the idea that it was nationalism. It was nationalism that was the problem. Well, maybe, but maybe it was the way that the nations were set up, so that they were being ruled by all of Europe at that point was being ruled by Queen Victoria's family. So maybe it was an internecine war. It is really hard to know. It is hard to know why this destruction happened. Maybe it was just like, Norman Mailer once said about cancer. Maybe the reason they can't cure cancer is because cancer is just death, and eventually death will come. And maybe that's it. Maybe civilizations just die, and it was time for Europe to die, and it did die. What is there now is not the Europe of old. It is not even, I don't even think it's going to survive another century in its present form. And it also destroyed, World War I also destroyed the concept of patriotism, the sure and certain idea that sweet, dulce et decorum est pro patria more, sweet and right it is to die for one's fatherland. That was the thing that came under fire. There was a famous poem called Dulce et decorum est by Wilfred Owen. Many of the poems written at this time were written by gay men, which is really interesting. So these were outsiders, people who were kind of excluded from society in some ways, who said, well, why did we wind up in these trenches? It's not that they weren't brave. It's not that they didn't go and fight. He wrote this, the famous poem in which he talks about men being gassed. This was the first time poison gas was used, and it was so hideous to watch people die. He talks about a man being thrown into a wagon where he's dying, and he says, if in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. So that, some of the poetry, it's a beautiful poem. It is a fantastic poem. So if you want to read stuff, I'm talking about stuff I like, if you want to read some wonderful stuff about World War I, it is well worth it to read the poetry that came out of it. Also, the wonderful patriotic poem that came out at the very beginning, "If I should die, say only this of me, there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." That was a beautiful poem, but those kinds of feelings of patriotism disappeared. Great book to read, The Great War and Modern Memory by Paul Fussell, Fussell, I think it is. The Great War and Modern Memory. It's a classic. I think it was published about 25 years ago. Talks about the way the war infected our culture and infects our memory and our imagination still. Thomas Mann's novel, Magic Mountain, it is not an easy novel. It is a philosophical novel. It's told about a tubercular ward, a TB ward, and it's the story of a TB ward, and it basically is comparing the Europe that comes before the war as a group of sick people. And it's a philosophical novel about the state of Europe, kind of discussing why the war came almost as a relief to people, because they went off with great celebration, great patriotism, thinking they were going to a brief battle that would be over in months, and instead, 4 years later, the entire civilization had been destroyed. And of course, one of the most famous novels, All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. It's a spectacular novel, an anti-war novel, and it was made into a beautiful film in the 30s that just hammers home this idea. A young man goes off to war inspired by his professor, who tells him about the iron men of valor and how you have to die for your country. Sweet and right it is to die for your country. And then he comes back from the front, and he sees the professor saying this to people again, saying this to the young men again, and inspiring them to go to war. And he wanders into the class, and the professor says, "How wonderful that you're here. Now you should inspire them. Tell them how wonderful it is to go to war." And here's a little bit of the scene from the wonderful 1930 version of All Quiet on the Western Front.
If you remember some deed of heroism, some touch of nobility, tell about it.
I can't tell you anything you don't know. We live in the trenches out there. We fight. We try not to be killed. Sometimes we are. That's all.
No, Paul. I've been there. I know what it's like. That's not what one dwells on, Paul.
I heard you in here reciting that same old stuff, making more iron men, more young heroes. You still think it's beautiful and sweet to die for your country, don't you? We used to think you knew. The first bombardment taught us better.
A war so terrible, so useless, so senseless that it changed the world forever. And its attitudes, it gave power to the left. So much power that it even began the Soviet Union. It gave power to the left in its anti-patriotism and its sense that forces beyond our control were throwing us to death. It is a war well worth studying, and brilliant things have been written about it, and really interesting things that need to be considered, because the logic of war may be relentless. It may be that we can't avoid wars ultimately, but they can destroy everything good that we have. Thank God for the soldiers who stand on guard and hopefully prevent wars from happening with strength. And thank God for their courage when they do have to go and fight. Just like, as I said at the beginning, just like we should thank God for the police who charge in to dangerous situations to protect not only our safety, but our rights as well.